on Vibrate. I would like to now welcome Associate Dean Ann LaFaso to the podium to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Amber. Amber is our Law Review's editor-in-chief, and I think you can tell from her grace and aplomb that our Law Review is in the skillful hands of a future leader in our profession. I'd like also to thank the Law Review students for their dedication to excellence. The museum portion of this day could not be accomplished without their hard work. I'd like to single out Shireen Compton of the Law Review for managing the student ambassadors. Shireen is pure joy to work with, always pleasant, always on time, and always professional. I must add, given the beauty of our museum-like reception, you would never know that the Law Review held its annual symposium just yesterday. Could the Law Review students please stand? Thank you. You really have done a wonderful job this week. I know it's been very hard work for you. No event such as this can take place without the Dean's support. We at WVU Law have been blessed to have the generous and inspiring Dean Joyce McConnell. This law school is the special place that it is because of her magnanimous spirit and her near magical, miraculous accomplishments as Dean during these turbulent times in the legal academy. There are also two other women who I must recognize for their tireless dedication, Margaret Obush and Stuart Pline. Margaret is our masterful events coordinator, and Stuart is our library archivist. I have yet to meet any other person who gives such flawless attention to detail as Margaret and Stuart. Thank you both, as well as to Kristen, James, Lewis, and Keith, and for all the other oft-times invisible workers who have labored to make today happen. 3 years ago, this December, Professor Ed Baker passed away due to complications from diabetes. He was 62 years old. For those of us who knew him, Ed's life was far too short. We are, however, comforted by the fact that Ed lived his life fully each and every day in a manner that pleased him. I came to know Ed in the late 1980s when he was my constitutional law professor at Penn Law. Ed spoke softly with a Southern accent, which despite years of living in New York City, he never lost. That voice was his trademark, and it is his voice which I remember most about him. A beautiful speaking voice, always tranquil, and used always to communicate a message concerning justice, liberty, democracy, or equality. Ed cared deeply about the kind of world we lived in. Ed's life work was dedicated to describing this world, showing us where we fell short of our ideals, and suggesting policies that would help us to build a better world. To describe that world, Ed's work was empirical. To show us where we fell short, Ed's work was sharply critical, analytical, and jurisprudential. Ed theorized about the law, always searching for those values that best describe the world he wanted to construct, and then used those values to judge how well we were doing. I suspect that were Ed alive today, he would be very disappointed in many ways and delighted in others. To suggest policies for building a better world, Ed's work was political, sociological, and peppered with policy. We are here today to celebrate Ed Baker, the former Nicholas F. Galicchio Professor of Law and Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, a leading scholar of constitutional law, communication law, and mass media policy, and one of the most cited free speech theorists of the 20th century. The Ed Baker Lecture has been endowed by the Baker family to preserve Ed's legacy as the best the legal academy has to offer in teaching and writing about liberty, equality, and democracy. Allow me now to turn the stage over to my friend Bob Bastris, a free speech scholar in his own right, to introduce today's guest speaker.
Thank you. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce this year's C. Edwin Baker Lecturer. Susan H. William, who is currently the Walter W. Foskett Professor of Law at the Indiana University School of Law. Professor Williams obtained her BA degree from Harvard University, it's up in Cambridge, where she graduated as a member of Phi Beta Kappa, which is not too shabby, even if it was at Harvard. She stayed in Cambridge to earn her JD from Harvard Law School, where she served as supervising editor of the Harvard Law Review. After graduation, she clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. She then began her academic career at Cornell University School of Law and did that in 1986 and remained there until 1991 when she moved to Indiana University. She eventually, of course, was then awarded the Foskett Chaired Professorship. During her career, Professor Williams has established herself as a prodigious scholar with dozens of articles and books to her credit, including, and most notably, the highly acclaimed book, Truth, Autonomy, and Speech, Feminist Theory, and the First Amendment, which was published in 2004 by the New York University Press. While at Indiana University, she co-founded and now directs the Center for Constitutional Democracy, which works with fledgling and wannabe democracies around the world to develop meaningful and effective constitutional designs. She has done yeoman work in such places as Burma and Liberia and in several Islamic states to bring democracy to the rest of this world. It has been challenging, I'm sure, and demanding work, but important. Professor Williams, however, is here today in her capacity as a renowned First Amendment scholar. Her First Amendment work covers the breadth of the freedoms of expression and conscience, delving the depths of both doctrinal and conceptual aspects of the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. Most notably, she has established herself as one of the leading elaborators, if indeed not the leading one, on feminist perspectives of First Amendment concepts and issues. She has pushed the scholarship to confront the freedom of speech from different vantage points, forcing a thoughtful and provocative re-examination on why we value the freedom of expression. As she put it in one recent article, feminism offers a critique that is fundamentally relational, contextual, and normative, i.e., different. It is highly appropriate that Susan Williams is here today as our second Ed Baker lecturer. One reason is that she was a friend of Professor Baker, but also that she participated in a colloquy that he organized, and that included the real luminaries of today's First Amendment scholarship, including Susan, Robert Post, Vincent Blasi, Eugene Volokh, and others. More substantively, her scholarship addresses many of the themes that resounded through Ed Baker's own work, particularly that on autonomy and truth. But she has elaborated and expanded on those themes, once again offering new and fresh perspectives, adding mightily to the scholarship. And I think you will see that in today's lecture. I also think you're in for a treat, and I present to you Susan Williams.
Hello. Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Bob for that very kind introduction, and also Dean McConnell and Professor Mafaso and the whole West Virginia University College of Law for inviting me today. And last but not least, Nancy Baker for her generosity in donating her brother's library and establishing this lectureship in his name. The really quite wonderful exhibit that I just saw beautifully captures the spirit of this remarkable man. Professor Ed Baker was an outstanding scholar of the First Amendment, but he was also much more. He was a kind and generous colleague who reached out to help younger scholars, as I know from my own experience of his support and encouragement over many years. He was an impassioned defender of liberty, and because of his brilliance, his integrity, and his sincerity, he was an inspiration to everyone who knew him. I am honored to deliver a lecture that bears his name, and I'm grateful to you for this opportunity to express my affection and respect for him. So thank you very much. Now, the subject of my lecture today is a feminist theory of free speech. And perhaps when you heard or read that title, you thought that maybe I was going to talk about pornography or sexual harassment or one of the other areas of law where freedom of speech intersects with feminist concerns. But I don't intend to add to the already large literatures about these issues. Instead, I want to offer you some thoughts about an area of First Amendment scholarship in which the contribution of feminism has as yet been much smaller, and that area is the theory of free speech. Free speech theory addresses foundational questions, such as, why do we regard freedom of speech as a right? What justifies the special protection given to speech by the First Amendment, as opposed to other sorts of activities that the government is generally free to regulate? What is so special about speech? In American jurisprudence, there have traditionally been three answers to that question. The first answer argues that speech is necessary to the discovery and spread of truth. This view is associated with John Stuart Mill, and it has a number of contemporary supporters, including Eugene Volokh. The second answer argues that speech is special because of its role in democracy. Professors Alexander Meiklejohn, Cass Sunstein, and Robert Post are probably the most prominent proponents of variations on this democracy theory. The third answer argues that speech is special because it is crucial to individual autonomy, and the First Amendment represents a limit on the powers of a legitimate government that must respect such autonomy. Professor Ed Baker was certainly the most important American theorist to offer this view. Now, there's a large and diverse literature in which these three primary positions are defended and criticized and analyzed, but there is a noticeable gap in this literature. There is no explicitly feminist perspective on free speech theory. This gap is all the more remarkable because feminist theorists in political philosophy have been actively involved in debates over the concepts of truth, democracy, and autonomy, on which the primary theories of speech are based. In general, feminist theorists have been very critical of the traditional models of truth, democracy, and autonomy, and they've suggested alternative models based on women's experiences and perspectives. Such criticisms and alternatives raise the rather obvious question: what would freedom of speech look like if we took seriously these feminist arguments about the underlying concepts on which free speech theory rests? So today I'm going to offer you one piece of an answer to this question, and in honor of Professor Baker, I'm going to discuss the piece focused on autonomy. I'll begin by giving you a brief summary of Professor Ed Baker's autonomy theory of free speech. I'll then draw out two themes that I believe are important to his theory, and I'll use those themes to begin to outline a feminist approach to autonomy, explaining the ways in which this feminist approach grows out of some of the central concerns of Ed's work, but also the ways in which the two approaches differ. Finally, I'm going to suggest some of the consequences for free speech law of adopting this feminist view of autonomy, including the implications for two of the more controversial current issues in First Amendment jurisprudence: commercial speech regulation and political campaign finance regulation. So, let's start with Professor Baker's autonomy theory. Ed suggests that autonomy should be understood as a person's right to make decisions about herself. Now, he distinguishes what he calls this formal conception of autonomy from a more substantive conception. A substantive conception would focus on the person's capacity to actually pursue successfully the life she's chosen. But he wants to focus on the right to freely choose, rather than on whether the person has the necessary resources or abilities to implement those choices effectively. So autonomy is about choosing for ourselves. The alternative to autonomy, then, is coercion, having our choices dictated in some sense from outside of us. Ed works hard to develop a useful model of coercion, one that focuses on mechanisms that disrespect autonomy, treating another person as less than autonomous. In the course of explicating his concept of coercion, he relies upon a sophisticated and nuanced view of the role of social forces in constructing personal identity. He acknowledges that, and here I'm quoting, personhood and much of the specific content of a person's identity is a social or collective achievement. Nonetheless, it is the individual choice that provides the normative grounding for autonomy in Ed's theory, not the relationships in which autonomy grows or from which it takes its substance. Okay, so autonomy is choosing for ourselves. This is to be distinguished from coercion. How is speech related to autonomy when you define it this way? There are two ways that speech is related. First, speech is helpful for developing the capacity for self-realization and self-determination. So through speech, we learn how to reflect critically, how to reason, and these capacities allow us to make our choices more freely. Second, speech is itself an exercise of personal autonomy. Through our speech, we express our choices and we participate in the development of our culture and society. Now, one of the challenges that any autonomy theory faces is to explain why speech is particularly important to autonomy. And the difficulty is that many, perhaps most, of our choices are not about speech. They're about other sorts of actions and activities. And yet the Constitution doesn't create the same high level of protection for all of these other choices as it does for speech. So if the point is to protect autonomy, why aren't our other choices protected in the same way as our speech choices? Ed uses his model of coercion to answer this question. He acknowledges that speech, like other activities, can cause harms that the government legitimately might wish to prevent. For example, harm to someone else's reputation. But speech, he says, generally causes harm in a non-coercive way. It causes harm by persuading an autonomous listener to behave in some way. So if I say something that hurts your reputation, the only reason it hurts your reputation is because some autonomous listener decided to believe me. And what he's arguing then is that although we exercise our autonomy through all our choices, speech is special because even when it causes harm, that harm generally operates through appealing to the autonomy of the listener rather than through overriding the autonomy of the listener. Okay, so we've got autonomy, we've got speech. The last step in the argument is to explain why the importance of speech to autonomy leads to a government obligation to respect speech, to a legal right. Here, Ed turns to a particular theory of political legitimacy. He argues that government is legitimate only if it respects the capacity for choice of its citizens. Only a government that respects its citizens' autonomy has the right to demand their obedience to the laws, laws that will inevitably hurt some people. Now, respecting citizens' autonomy actually takes many forms. One of these forms, in fact, is requiring a fundamentally democratic system. But one of the forms of respect is protection for freedom of speech. So, in this argument, Ed turns democracy theory on its head. What he says is democracy doesn't provide the justification for freedom of speech. Rather, autonomy provides the justification for both democracy and freedom of speech. All right, Professor Baker's theory then, just to sum up, outlines an individual choice-based model of autonomy, distinguishes it from coercion and connects it to speech, and explains why legitimate governments must respect this autonomy by protecting speech. Now, this is a rich and complex argument, but for our purposes today, I'm going to emphasize two themes that run through Professor Baker's theory, and they are his focus on relationality and his focus on inequality. First, while there is a foundational commitment to a type of individualism in Ed's work, there is also a profound appreciation for the ways in which human relationships are crucial for moral purposes. For Ed, the source of the government's obligation to respect autonomy is found in the nature of the moral relationship between partners in a human dialogue. The source is not, in his words, a solipsistic notion of reason, of the categorical imperative, or an isolated individual's autonomy. Instead, the source is the way we need to regard each other in order to be involved in the joint social enterprise of building a polity and a culture together. In other words, why is autonomy so important? It's so important because people who are trying to build a society together have to regard each other as autonomous in order to do that. In other words, Ed includes a strong focus on relationships as central, along with his concern for individuals. Second, Ed is deeply aware of issues of inequality and tries always to take account of them in his work. While he believes that free speech theory must rest on this formal model of autonomy, which doesn't really pay attention to whether we have the resources to actuate our choices, nonetheless, he endorses the view that the role of government is often to pursue a more substantive model in which resources and opportunities available to people to live out their choices are the primary concern. In other words, trying to address inequality is one of the central concerns of government in Ed's approach. And I think this concern for equality is evident, very evident, in his more recent writing on the media and the need to break the monopoly held by a small number of corporations over what Americans see, hear, and read. Such monopolies limit the autonomy of both speakers and listeners. And in addressing this issue of media concentration, Ed saw clearly that the First Amendment has to be read as setting out certain goals for the system of freedom of speech, rather than merely guaranteeing particular rights to particular individuals within that system. In other words, even if the law doesn't prevent anybody from starting his own newspaper, we still don't have a well-functioning system of free speech if, in fact, in any major metropolitan area, there is likely to be only one daily newspaper. The fact that individuals are not constrained is not enough to make a good system of free speech. The system itself has to generate, overall, certain kinds of consequences. I think, although Ed's approach has its roots in an individualist tradition, he has added, in this way, very important dimensions focused both on relationality and on inequality. Now, these themes of relationality and inequality and the systemic focus that grows out of them are central to a feminist approach to free speech theory. Feminists in a wide range of disciplines, including philosophy, political theory, and psychology, have focused on the ways in which people's identities and capacities are fundamentally relational. Indeed, in their assessment of autonomy in particular, feminist theorists have argued that autonomy is relational causally, substantively, and conceptually. And I want to take a minute to explain each of those. So, first, autonomy is causally relational in the sense that we become autonomous through our relationships with other people. Nobody is born autonomous. We have to learn it. And we develop the capacities for autonomy through our relationships with others. For example, in order to be autonomous, to choose your own values and to try to live by them, we need self-esteem. We need to believe that we're worthwhile and that we're capable of accomplishing things. If we thought that we were worthless or unable to take action, we wouldn't even bother trying to live by our own values or to choose for ourselves. But self-esteem is developed through relationships. Children learn self-esteem when their caretakers respond to their needs and convey to them that they are worthwhile. Indeed, it's the continuing recognition and responsiveness of other people that sustains this belief in self-worth in adults as well. The capacities required for autonomy are causally relational then, in the sense that they require certain social relationships for their creation and maintenance in individual persons. The second sense in which autonomy is relational is that the very substance out of which our autonomous choices are made is given to us in social relationships rather than invented by us. The values, ideals, categories, and identities among which we choose are social products, and they're passed on to us through our relationships with others in our culture. So, for example, I might choose an action because I'm a good mother, or I'm a free spirit, or I'm a liberal, or I'm a conservative. As Jennifer Nadelsky has written, quote, "The particular choices I make are comprehensible only with reference to shared social norms, values, and concepts," unquote. Finally, and most fundamentally, autonomy is conceptually, inherently relational. Autonomy, quite literally, is about self-rule. But as Susan Bryson has noted, quote, "Not to be heard means that the self does not exist. The self needs to be known and acknowledged by others in order to exist. There is no sense in which a person can be described as autonomous in isolation. Only in relation to others is autonomy possible." Now, the focus on choice in most traditional models of autonomy, including Professor Baker's, is problematic from this feminist point of view. The fixed attention to the act of choice makes sense only if we are not paying so much attention to the surrounding web of relationships in which the chooser is embedded. The point in choice is that it is internal. In some sense, it belongs to the agent rather than to anyone else. The point in choice is to distinguish action that is internally generated from action that is determined by something outside the person, that is, coercion. The point in choice is to ground autonomy on something that's insulated from such external forces and that can therefore truly be said to be our own. But once we take seriously the relational aspects in our concept of autonomy, we have to abandon this illusion of insularity. It's not that we don't make choices. The experience of choice is still a real and significant aspect of our moral lives. But choice, when it's understood in this relational context, can't provide the sort of insulated foundation for autonomy that distinguishes it from coercion. So feminist theory shares with Professor Baker the concern for relationality, but it takes that concern to a deeper level of critique at which it calls into question the focus on choice as the central act of autonomy. Similarly, the feminist concern with inequality also builds on Professor Baker's insight and ultimately pushes further toward a systemic approach. Unsurprisingly, one of the central themes of feminism is concern for those who are excluded or marginalized. And in their critique of traditional models of autonomy, feminist theorists have pointed out that in addition to the conceptual problems that I just discussed, there is a moral and political problem with these choice-based models. The model of autonomy focused on critical reason, reflection, and choice by individuals encapsulates and perpetuates gender hierarchy. The model encapsulates gender hierarchy. It's built in to the model because the model is based on an experience that's far more typical of men than women in our society. This experience is one of separation and fundamental independence as an individual. But psychologists such as Carol Gilligan have demonstrated that men are more likely than women to experience their separateness as central to their identities. Women are more likely to begin from an assumption of connection, in which relationships rather than separate individuals are the focus. Now, I want to quickly add that for our purposes, it doesn't matter whether we regard these differences as biologically based or as a result of gender role training. As long as the generalizations are true for many people, men and women in our society, then a model of autonomy focused on individual choice will lead systematically to a situation in which many women fail to fit the model and are therefore seen as less autonomous and, indeed, less deserving of the rights that are due to autonomous persons. And, in fact, the model of autonomy focused on individual choice has a history of contributing to gender inequality. Now, Professor Baker, of course, recognizes and resists this history. He wants to focus attention on inequality as a central issue. From a feminist perspective, however, this attention to inequality should push us towards an even greater focus on the systemic aspects of social systems rather than on individual choices. So, for example, I was suggesting a minute ago that autonomy is learned and sustained through social relationships. If that's the case, and we start paying attention to inequality, we would very quickly notice that the conditions for autonomy, this sort of recognition and responsiveness by other people, are not equally distributed in our society. Imbalances in recognition occur across lines of race, class, sexual orientation, and disability, as well as gender. Think about the very common situation in a business meeting where a woman makes a suggestion and there's a silence and the conversation goes on for a while until a man makes the same suggestion and then everybody notices it. That sort of failure of recognition is exactly the kind of inequality that we're talking about here. And a focus on inequality would require us to address the underlying systems that generate these sorts of imbalances in the resources for autonomy. In other words, it's not enough to protect the choices people are currently capable of making under the existing system. We also have to ask about whether the system as a whole supports the capacities and opportunities for autonomy. Okay, so the themes of relationality and attention to inequality in Professor Baker's work are shared by feminist theorists across a wide range of disciplines. And in the hands of these theorists, the themes are expanded in ways that shift the focus of autonomy from individual choice to the social relationships that support the development of capacities and the exercise of self-direction. Now, what would a feminist model of autonomy based on these insights look like? And how would it be connected to freedom of speech? Let's turn now to those questions. If choice is not the central activity of autonomy, then what is? I would suggest that the feminist focus on relationality and equality would lead to what I've called a narrative model of autonomy, in which the central activity is telling one's own story, determining the meaning of one's own life. A narrative model identifies the focus of autonomy not as an act of volition or choice, but rather as an act of interpretation and narration. The primary experience of autonomy takes place not when we choose, but when we tell our stories. The meaning of autonomy is that, as Susan Bryson so beautifully puts it, one's identity and life are not the object or medium of someone else's speech, but rather the subject of one's own. Now, one obvious question raised by this narrative model of autonomy is whether there's any role for action here. In other words, if I can determine the meaning of my own life, but I'm subject to constraints that prevent me from acting on it, am I still autonomous? In answer to that question, I think it's useful to distinguish between freedom and autonomy. Freedom requires not only that I be autonomous, in the sense I've been describing, but also that I experience some degree of freedom from constraints on my action, that is negative liberty, and some degree of support for the resources, opportunities, and capacities necessary for my action, that is positive liberty. Autonomy, then, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for freedom. One might be autonomous, but in many ways unfree because of limits on negative or positive liberty. Seeing autonomy and freedom in this way helps us to recognize the autonomy that can be and often is exercised by people under conditions of oppression. Even when their freedom of choice is drastically and unjustly curtailed, people can and do exercise the autonomy to tell their own stories and make their own meanings. This focus on meaning doesn't eliminate either the importance or the experience of choice. It is most often in response to the need to make a choice that we engage in self-conscious efforts to make meaning of our lives. But it's certainly not the only time that we feel the need to revise or retell our stories. A dramatic change in your life, brought about with or without your choice, such as a natural disaster or an illness or the birth or death of a family member, commonly causes us to return to the conscious process of determining the meaning of our lives. So choice is only one of many occasions for the exercise of narrative autonomy. Similarly, choice is only one of many outcomes of the exercise of narrative autonomy. Once you've told your story, usually we feel that that leads us to certain kinds of choices. But our stories also lead us to certain kinds of knowledge about ourselves or the world, as well as to certain kinds of relationships with other people. Think about an occasion on which you thought back over a particularly hard period in your own life. And maybe you told the story in a new and different way, perhaps seeing those earlier difficulties not just as bad luck, but as injustice. And think about how telling the story in that different way led you to a different view about the world you inhabit and your relationships to other people. This is, of course, the classic pattern of consciousness raising. And as this example illustrates, choice is unique neither as the occasion nor as the outcome of narrative autonomy. Now, in a narrative model of autonomy, our autonomy is always partial and always in process. We can be the authors of our own stories, but we are never the only authors. Autonomy understood in this way is neither a pre-existing moral condition that should be assumed for all people, as I believe it is for Ed and most other autonomy theorists, nor is it an end state that can be taken for granted once it's achieved. Instead, it's a process that has to be going on continually in order for a person to be autonomous. And this model suggests that autonomy can be achieved to different degrees and in different areas of our life. And it makes clear that our ability to be autonomous is dependent on social relationships and social conditions that are often beyond our individual control. We need others to help create and sustain in us the capacities on which our autonomy depends. Seeing autonomy as a social process has several advantages. First, when autonomy is seen as this sort of imperfect process for everyone, we have a much better way of thinking about the difficult issues raised by persons whose capacities for autonomy are less developed. Children, or perhaps adults with mental disabilities, who may have reduced capacities for rational reflection compared to average adults, have for that reason often been seen as less autonomous and therefore less deserving of the rights due to autonomous persons. But from the perspective of a narrative model of autonomy, everyone's autonomy is partial, episodic, and imperfect. The issue is not to find some minimum standard to mark out the people who are autonomous enough to deserve rights. Instead, the central issue is to think about the barriers and limitations that restrict autonomy for different groups of people, and to work to provide them with the opportunities and resources they need to increase their autonomy. In other words, the question is not whether the person is currently autonomous enough to demand rights. The question is how to structure their rights so as to facilitate their autonomy. Children might need rights that function differently from the rights of adults in order to facilitate their autonomy. But no one is categorically excluded from rights, and the question for all persons is essentially the same. A second advantage of focusing on narrative as the locus of autonomy is that it helps connect autonomy directly to speech. Unlike choice, which, as we said earlier, can concern any activity and is in no sense specific to speech, narrative, of course, is speech. To say that autonomy is about telling our stories is immediately to make speech central to autonomy in a way that no other activity is. Analyzing this relationship in a little more detail, though, we find that there are two primary ways in which speech is related to narrative autonomy. First, many speech acts would themselves be exercises of narrative autonomy, making meaning in one's life in a broad sense. Second, systems of speech, such as broadcasting markets or the financing of political campaigns. These systems affect the possibilities of autonomy for many, many people. Now, the systems can have two different effects. First, they can increase or decrease the opportunities to exercise autonomy. So, for example, as Ed has pointed out, the structure of our media market can make it easier or harder for large numbers of people to participate in shaping the culture. But second, speech systems can also facilitate or hinder the development of the capacities for autonomy. So, for example, the organization of our public school system can encourage or discourage the imagination and critical thinking skills necessary for narrative autonomy. The relationship here is a little different, though. Speech is uniquely significant to the exercise of narrative autonomy. It is through the manipulation of symbolic systems, that is, speech, that we tell our stories, that we engage in interpretation, communication, and creating meaning. On the other hand, speech is not uniquely significant to developing the capacities for autonomy. Certainly, an economic system that generates great inequalities in wealth is at least as important in affecting the potential for many people to develop these capacities as any system of speech. But speech systems, and just to give you a sense here, what does a speech system mean? It means things like the educational system, the mass media, the internet, government funding for the arts, the rules concerning use of government property for speech, and campaign finance. Okay, all of those are speech systems. These are obviously one important category of background institutions that shape our capacities for narrative autonomy. Okay, so you now have a thumbnail sketch of a feminist model of autonomy, and I'm going to turn to the First Amendment. What difference would it make if we use this narrative model as the basis of our free speech theory? I think it's actually going to help, and I'm going to illustrate with two examples. The first is the First Amendment status of commercial speech, and the second is the regulation of campaign finance. Commercial speech basically means advertising. Traditionally, advertising did not receive any First Amendment protection at all. It was considered unprotected and subject to government regulation. But in 1976, in a case called Virginia Pharmacy, the Supreme Court changed all of that. It found that commercial speech does have some First Amendment value, and it gets some protection. Government is still allowed to regulate advertising in ways that it couldn't regulate fully protected speech, such as political speech. For example, the government can regulate advertising to make sure it's true and not misleading, which it couldn't do for political speech. But the regulation must be directly related to a substantial state interest and no broader than necessary to serve that interest. In other words, the court applies a sort of intermediate scrutiny to commercial speech, somewhere between the rational basis review that applies where no protected right is at issue and the strict scrutiny that should apply where one is. This test comes from a case called Central Hudson, and despite much complaining by many justices over the years, it is still the standard for commercial speech. Professor Baker and other autonomy theorists tend to think that commercial speech advertising should not be seen as protected speech at all. Ed argues, for example, that advertising is coerced by the market rather than freely chosen, and therefore it's not an exercise of autonomy. Advertising basically responds to market pressures. Producers will say whatever works. to sell their product, rather than being an expression of the substantively valued commitments of the speaker. As such, in Ed's view, it is not the sort of exercise of autonomy that the First Amendment is intended to protect. Now, this argument relies upon a particular picture of the distinctiveness of market pressures on economic enterprises. They are so inexorable, so different in kind or degree from the many other social influences that shape speech, that they justify a categorical exclusion for commercial speech. It also relies on the idea, discussed earlier, that autonomy is the assumed starting point for everyone. So if commercial speech is going to be excluded from protection, then it has to be demonstrated that it is subject to this special type of coercion that makes it non-autonomous. The problem with this approach, as Ed, I know, recognized and struggled with, is that many forms of speech are subject to a vast range of types and amounts of coercion. From the perspective of narrative autonomy, we all operate under such pressures constantly, and they interact in ways that are highly individual in determining the range of choices open to us. There is no reason to believe that the pressures of the market on commercial speech are different either in kind or degree from the pressures experienced by other speakers in a host of situations where everyone agrees their speech is protected. For example, imagine a religious believer who speaks in favor of his group's values, but maybe he's been subjected to the threat of ostracism and exclusion to pressure him into this speech. We would still regard it as protected. Indeed, we don't even ask about these background conditions for other categories of speech. Thinking of autonomy as a precondition for speech puts us in the unrealistic and, I think, untenable position of trying to draw a line to mark the area of speech that is autonomous enough to receive constitutional protection. So what happens if you take a narrative approach instead? If you take a narrative approach and see autonomy not as a precondition, but as a process, and as a process that's dependent on social relationships, then the problems posed by commercial speech look very different. It's not the breadth or narrowness of choices left open by social pressures that determines whether speech is protected. The central question is instead whether the speech system surrounding commercial speech allows and encourages people to develop and exercise the capacity to make meaning in their lives. In other words, the issue is whether the commercial speech system is sufficiently protective of narrative autonomy. Now, if we ask the question that way, it would lead us to a different set of considerations. In thinking about the speaker, we might ask whether the social safety net in our society is sufficient to allow people some realistic opportunity to express their creativity at the risk of their jobs. We might ask about ways of encouraging corporate cultures that nurture creativity. We might ask about the structure of a market that could incorporate the pursuit of values other than, in addition to, profit. In terms of the listeners, we might ask about the impact of the massive wave of commercial speech on our capacities for reflection and on our sense of self-worth. We might think about the potential for creative resistance to these effects and the ways that speech systems could facilitate that resistance. I'm not actually going to tell you whether commercial speech should be protected or unprotected. I don't think that's the interesting question. The considerations I just outlined might lead to some commercial speech being unprotected. I'm not sure. What I think is more important is that they would certainly lead us to the conclusion that efforts by the government to improve commercial speech systems don't violate the First Amendment, even if they do impose some costs on the speech currently generated by that system. The point is not to focus on the choices people currently have alone, but rather to focus on the way in which the system facilitates and encourages narrative autonomy. And let me suggest to you, I think this is more honest in certain ways because that's the real problem with commercial speech. The reason many people want to exclude advertising from First Amendment protection is because they see it has a damaging effect on listeners. But denying First Amendment protection to advertising because it's not autonomous doesn't begin to address the underlying systemic issues. It just makes it easier to ignore them by blunting some of the social costs they impose. In other words, it allows the government to restrict some of the most damaging forms of commercial speech, like cigarette advertising, without changing the underlying structures that make advertising in general problematic. The value of a narrative model is that it directs our attention to these systemic concerns, and that, I think, is the heart of the problem. Okay. Quickly, the last example. A narrative model of autonomy would also lead to a useful new approach to campaign finance regulation, a subject that is on all of our minds. The Supreme Court's approach to these sorts of regulations has been very doctrinally complicated. But from the perspective of free speech theory, the landscape is much simpler. Most autonomy theorists have seen regulations of campaign finance as a violation of the First Amendment. Now, this is where Ed, again, shines. He, because of his concerns for equality and the more systemic approach that leads him to, he actually has argued that campaign finance regulation can be constitutional because it concerns the workings of an institution, elections, that have a particular goal. And the goal is to generate good representatives through a process of equal participation. Now, I agree with him about this outcome, but I think a narrative model of autonomy makes this result easier to understand and to justify. And I'll tell you why. Autonomy-based theories generally are understood to block campaign finance regulation for two reasons. First, restrictions on campaign financing arguably violates the autonomy of the would-be speaker whose contributions or expenditures are restricted. And second, such laws serve a government purpose of restricting speech, for example, speech by corporations, because of the fear that the speech will lead voters to make bad choices. And that is a form of paternalism that the Court has found inconsistent with the autonomy of listeners. Let me respond to each of these arguments. The first objection focuses on the autonomy of the speaker, whose choices and expression are limited by the regulation. From the perspective of a narrative model of autonomy, political campaign speech is, indeed, a powerful and important exercise of autonomy. But from this perspective, there are competing autonomy claims at stake in other aspects of the situation, and they have to be balanced against the speaker's autonomy claims. Because autonomy is dependent on social relationships, any system of speech can be and should be examined to determine whether it supports or inhibits those relationships. And Professor Vince Blasi, who gave this lecture last year, has developed an innovative argument suggesting that candidates for electoral office lose a great deal of their own narrative autonomy in the frantic and all-consuming rush to amass a war chest that will secure their election. The campaign is no longer an opportunity to tell their own stories, but simply a search for money. One reason to impose limits on campaign expenditures is to stop what he refers to as the widening gyre of fundraising. A relational model of autonomy, which recognizes the ways in which social conditions support or inhibit autonomy, allows us to see this interest on the part of candidates as an autonomy interest. Similarly, the harms to citizens generally identified by proponents of campaign finance reform can also be seen as implicating narrative autonomy. Unrestrained contributions or expenditures in political campaigns hurt the autonomy of those whose ability to participate in public dialogue is thereby unjustly reduced. Right? Money buys political advantages. Despite the fact that the Supreme Court seems not able to see this, most of the rest of us can. And if money buys political advantages, then people who spend more money get more of those advantages. And if they got those advantages only because they have more money, that is unfair to the people who don't have access. It's a pretty straightforward argument. What narrative autonomy adds, though, is it can explain why this is, in fact, not just unjust generally, but a harm to autonomy. The process of telling one's story takes place within social relationships. The story has to be told to others and recognized and reflected by others in order to be effective. And politics is one of the most important venues for narrative autonomy. It is one of the most important places where we collectively tell our stories and get them recognized by other people. The reduction in opportunities for political participation, then, on the basis of wealth, which is a morally irrelevant characteristic, is an injury to autonomy. So the autonomy interests of speakers have to be balanced against the autonomy interests of candidates and of listeners. The second objection to campaign finance regulation, you remember, rested on the idea that the government's goal here was an illegitimate form of paternalism. The difficulty is that campaign finance reform serves a range of purposes, and from a narrative autonomy perspective, not all of them suffer from paternalism. If the government really is trying to stop speech because it's afraid that the foolish citizens will be misled by it and make bad choices, that is paternalist. And that's a violation of autonomy. But that's actually very rarely the way campaign finance laws are justified. If, on the other hand, what the government says is, we're not worried about the citizens, we're worried about the candidates and the effect of this money on them, that's not paternalist. Or if the government says, as Vince Blasey suggests, we're worried about the effect on the candidate's time, that's not paternalist. And if they say, and this is the most important point, what we're worried about is reducing inequalities of participation in politics, that is neither paternalistic nor inconsistent with autonomy. It does not short-circuit the process of autonomy. It tries instead to guarantee autonomy to larger numbers of people in greater degree. And if the point in protecting free speech is to protect narrative autonomy, then the government has a legitimate, perhaps even a compelling interest in assuring that systems of free speech provide adequate opportunities for the exercise of autonomy. A feminist approach to free speech theory, then, involves reimagining some of the basic concepts that lie at the foundation of our justifications for freedom of speech. Autonomy is one of these foundational concepts, and Professor Baker was its most important proponent. In his work, he developed both a more relational and a more egalitarian vision of autonomy. These themes of relationality and equality are central also to a feminist approach to autonomy. When these themes are expanded, I believe that they lead to a model of autonomy based not on individual choice, but on the social relationships in which we develop the capacities and exercise the opportunities to make meaning in our lives. And this model, in turn, leads to a reorientation of First Amendment jurisprudence, in which the focus is on speech systems and whether they are promoting these capacities and opportunities, and not only on the particular exercise of autonomy by particular individuals. This systemic focus, I believe, allows us to address some of the crucial issues of inequality that autonomy theory has traditionally marginalized and that Professor Baker worked to bring into greater focus. Those of us who work in this field miss Ed very much. But through the influence of his work, one example of which I've just tried to offer you, Ed continues to be a generous and inspiring leader, keeping alive the ideals of freedom of speech and of liberty for future generations of scholars and, I hope, citizens. Thank you. Oh, good. For a moment, I was afraid I'd actually convinced everyone.
Thank you again for being with us. Just a couple of things. Let me just start here. You've drawn a contrast, right, between kind of systemic approaches and less systemic approaches, and you've also talked about different models of autonomy, right? And when we think about models of autonomy, we can have this picture of autonomy just means you're choosing, and then it's easy to make fun of this as, the atomistic individual who chooses and exercises his will in this kind of Nietzschean way, and everybody mocks that. You can talk about relationality, which feminists had, and that goes all the way back to Hegel and George Herbert Mead and people like that. You can talk about Kantians and self-rule. So there are all these ways of sort of cashing this out, right? Mm-hmm. So two things. One, it seems to me that with respect to the examples you gave about campaign finance reform and about commercial speech, almost no matter what model of autonomy you adopt, other than maybe the sort of bare Nietzschean will model of autonomy, mm-hmm. right, it's really the shift to sort of looking at systemic consequences that seems to make the big difference, right? So I can imagine somebody saying, whether I believe that narrative autonomy is it or not, I might have a particular view of commercial speech and of campaign finance regulation based on the idea that what we're looking for is kind of a healthy system that creates conditions for certain kinds of flourishing, right? So your reaction to that. The second one was just this. It seems to me that it's interesting to sort of say, well, I'm going to focus on this narrative aspect of autonomy. Yet, when we think about free speech theory in terms of we're going to connect the importance that we place on speech to either truth or democracy or autonomy, it's because we think we're sort of connecting it to something different that we think is even more self-evidently important than we think speech is, right? Mm-hmm. When we make autonomy into a form of the stories we tell about ourselves, we're making it kind of closer to speech in the first place. So we're almost back to the point where we're resting sort of speech on its own foundation, which works for us here because we have such a long tradition of thinking speech is important. Maybe in other places, and you know more about this than I, that may not be so self-evidently true. Anyway, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Those are a whole series of wonderful questions. So let me see if I can answer as many of them as I can remember. Okay, so first, why not just go to systemic approaches, but base them on choice? Right? Why shift to a focus on narrative? Couldn't we talk about systems that control choices? Yeah, we could. I think there are, and that would be better. Okay, that would be an improvement. And in fact, I think that's a lot of what Ed did. Okay, so I see that as a valuable thing. I think focusing on choice misses, though, the sense in which we really construct our autonomy in concert with other people. And I don't think that's, again, inevitable, right? One could modify the understanding of choice to make choice more relational, but I haven't seen that. And although Ed moved some in that direction, I don't think it went as far as it needs to. So my hope is that by shifting to the idea of narration, it allows us to see it, because communication in its nature presupposes that you're communicating to or with someone. It builds relationality into the very concept in a way that choice, generally people think they make choices by themselves. Right? They may talk to other people about their choices, or they may not. But the inherent act of choice we imagine as internal to the individual. And I want to move autonomy to an act that's not internal to the individual in order to achieve some of these other goals, right? Seeing it as partial, seeing it as processual, seeing it as fundamentally social. Okay? So my goals for the model being narrative are those things. But you're right that many of the specific doctrinal responses could be achieved through other paths. And actually, this is another thing I want to sort of appreciate in your comment, which is I've been pulling on feminist theorists as the foundation for this. You could come at this from a whole bunch of other directions, right? There are a lot of people who believe in social construction of the self, and any of those schools of thought would give rise to a very similar approach to autonomy. So I actually think it's a great virtue and strength of feminist theory that it overlaps with so many other ways of approaching the same problems. I don't see that as a problem, but that's just my particular literature. Okay. And now I'm going to have trouble remembering. I should have brought a pen. I'm going to have trouble remembering the second piece. Help me?
The question was, when you focus on a narrative conception of autonomy,
right.
Do we get the idea that we're focusing
That's it.
speech on its own foundation, where normally we're trying to sort of connect it to something that we think is different and more fundamental?
Excellent. Thank you. That's not how I see it, but I think it's a very interesting risk that I would need to be aware of. The whole theory, as far as I'm concerned, is not just autonomy. It's autonomy and truth. And both autonomy and truth should be understood in relational, socially constructed ways. And I think when you add truth, it becomes plain that what we're talking about here is something that goes on through symbolic systems of meaning-making, but where the symbolic systems of meaning-making, speech, are a means to other ends, right? The ends being autonomy and truth understood in a more socially constructed way. So I think speech is still the means, autonomy is still the end, but autonomy is understood in a more speech-based way. That's right. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Great questions. Anybody else? It takes a PhD in philosophy to ask a question, I can see. Okay. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. Please, if there is.
My question won't rise to the level of Professor Taylor's, but I do have a question. I'd like your reaction to the proliferation of outlets for speech in society, which on its face seems to be good. More people have access. And I'm talking about, radio channels in your car. I'm talking about cable. I'm talking about self-publishing. I'm talking about all these different ways that we can get our views out. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that it also has an impact on the listener. The listener can choose to listen to only one version and maybe reinforce incorrect views. I mean, I suppose there's a truth issue running through this. Right. And it's unclear in my own mind where this is headed when our thoughts are so segmented in their publication. I'd appreciate your views on that.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. I think that's actually a very serious problem. I agree with you. That is, one wants to celebrate the fact that it is so much easier to reach a mass audience than it used to be. There are so many more ways that are available to many more people with fewer resources, and that's a good thing, a really good thing. But along with that has come a situation where we're overwhelmed by the sheer volume of speech. And because we're overwhelmed by it, we've devised mechanisms to shield ourselves from all except the points of view we really want to hear. And the fact that there are news stations catering to different political outlooks, right? On the one hand, that's a great thing, right? I love Rachel Maddow. But on the other hand, I never hear, right, what people on the other side would say in response to anything that she might assert. And the same is true, for somebody who's watching Fox. And the difficulty is we can insulate ourselves so easily. In fact, I saw a remarkable video, someone who knows much more about computers than I do, explaining how the search engines that we all use actually set up filtering processes for us that we don't even choose. We're not even aware of them. They look at what we watch, and then they send us the things that they've decided are similar to what we've watched before, and they filter out the things that are different. So without us even trying, our universe of views is being limited in that way. I think that's all extremely dangerous. What we need, perhaps, is not to restrict this efflorescence of speech, but to recreate some more traditional public fora where citizens generally participate and where they come into contact with people with really different points of view. And to have those fora be more meaningful aspects of our lives. That's a tall order, and I don't have real specific suggestions to make about how it would be done, but I think that that's the direction we might need to think in. Sure. Great. Okay. Great. Thank you.